Last ceremony for the head of Tidewater Community College. Today, we learned that President Edna Barry Colavani is retiring.
Her departure comes amid several high-profile challenges facing the college. Mike Gooding spoke with the president today.
But just to be clear, there's no relationship between any of the stuff.
There really is not. There really is not, really is not.
It has been a time of much turmoil here at TCC, beginning with a 30% enrollment decline since 2012, followed by the announcement of faculty layoffs this spring, and then the announcement today of the retirement of TCC's president. The number of students dropped from 48,000 to 34,000. Facing a $4 to $6 million budget shortfall, a total of 34 full-time and part-time positions have been eliminated since December. President Edna Barry Colavani insists, though, that retiring has been on her mind for a long time.
About a year ago, I actually started thinking about retiring, and then I realized there were many initiatives underway that were in their infancy stages, our expansion programs, new marketing initiatives, recruitment initiatives. Plus I knew that we had to make some major budget decisions, and I thought the timing was not right a year ago.
Barry Colavani pointed to a number of successes during her tenure, saying she believes the ship is righted.
The future of TCC is very bright.
Barry Colavani's departure takes effect July 1st. In a statement, TCC's chancellor said he will soon appoint an interim president and begin a national search for a successor. Mike Gooding, 13 News Now.